Okay, welcome everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor for RedmondMag.com, here to moderate our first session as well as welcome you to our Microsoft and AI 101 Summit, What IT Pros Need to Know, brought to you by CoreView, Data Robot, and Data Miner. Before we start today's three-session event, we do have some announcements. First, we want to let you know this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Also, each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up so we can get them answered for you by our experts. And during today's third session, we will be giving away a Nintendo Switch. But you must be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsors, CoreView, Data Robot, and Data Miner, available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of our sponsors underwriting this content that we can bring you to Summit, so we thank them for supporting the community and ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's Summit, Microsoft, IT, and AI. How AI will change IT's future. This session features Brian Posey, a 22-time Microsoft MVP and a commercial astronaut candidate. Throughout Brian's career, he has written or contributed to dozens of IT books and created numerous full-length video training courses and published thousands of blog posts on a huge variety of IT and space-related topics. Many of those blog posts can be found in his Posey's Tips and Tricks column or in his new Posey's Moonshot column. Brian, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, David. Hello, greetings, and welcome, everyone. So today we're going to be talking all about AI and what it means for the IT industry as a whole. So what I'm really hoping to accomplish from this presentation is to spend some time talking about some of the technologies that are most likely to impact you in your day-to-day lives, whether in the form of having to support your end users or things you might use yourself or things that could potentially displace you or change the way that you do your job. And then the other thing that I want to accomplish is spending a little bit of time towards the end having a very frank and open discussion about the potential for losing your IT job as a result of AI taking over. So that's where I'm hoping to go with this. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, as I'm sure you know, AI is everywhere that you look. It's in the headlines. It's all over the place. You can't turn anywhere without hearing about AI. So AI is gaining huge momentum right now. And when I think about AI and what it means for the future, specifically with regard to the IT industry, I can't help but think about other transformative technologies of the past. And I'm talking about things that have absolutely nothing to do with AI, but are IT technologies or IT trends that really disrupted the industry. I'm talking about things like the emergence of the public cloud, or even the widespread adoption of the internet, Wi-Fi, tablets, bring your own device, and there are so many other examples. But these have been defining trends that have happened over the last 20 to 30 years. And even though history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, very often history closely mimics what's happened in the past. So my philosophy is that by taking a look at what type of impact these technologies had on the IT industry in the past, we can get a better sense of where things might be going with regard to AI. So all of those technologies that I mentioned, they all have certain things that are in common with one another, some to more of a degree than others, but the things on this list apply to everything that I just mentioned to at least some degree. First of all of them were dismissed by the naysayers. Take, for example, the Apple iPad. When that first came out, there were scathing reviews on it. There were tech publications that made fun of its name. I won't go into that because some of it was fairly crude. I read more than one review that was saying that the iPad was nothing but a larger version of the iPhone, and who in their right mind would use such a thing? And I'm just throwing the iPad out there as an example. I'm not trying to pick on Apple or anything like that. I'm just trying to underscore the point that everything that was on that list that I just mentioned was made fun of by the tech press at least some point. Also, there were massive concerns about security and privacy with every single one of those trends. Take, for example, Wi-Fi networks. IT administrators lost their minds when Wi-Fi started to become a thing, because previously networks had been wired, and the idea was that if you plugged into a network, then you could monitor the traffic flowing across that network. For a period of time back in the 90s, I worked for a large insurance company, and they took the threat of traffic monitoring so seriously that they actually took the unprecedented step of having IT go around the building, which was a very large building, and look at every single jack. And if there wasn't a PC directly plugged into that jack, then they cut the wires, just because they didn't want somebody sneaking into the building, going to some far-off corner that was out of sight of the security cameras, plugging in a laptop and sniffing their network traffic. That's how paranoid they were about network snooping. So you can only imagine how much they probably lost their minds when Wi-Fi came about. And that story isn't unique to them. There are so many other companies that I can think of that had huge security concerns about Wi-Fi. And again, Wi-Fi is just one example. The same could be said about all of the transformative technologies that I mentioned. Another thing that all of them had in common was that there were concerns about negative impacts to employee productivity. Take the internet, for example. When the web first started gaining mainstream adoption, there were a lot of companies that said, we're never going to allow our employees to access the internet because it's too big of a time waster. There's too much of a temptation to surf the internet and use it for non-business purposes. And of course, we see how that turned out. Another thing that most of these technologies and trends had in common was that there was always at least somebody that said it's the end of IT as we know it. This was especially true with regard to the public cloud. When public cloud first started really getting maturity, but before it started becoming widely adopted, there was a well-known tech CEO. I'm not going to name any names, but I promise you that it's somebody that most of you have heard of. And this tech CEO decided to call a meeting of the various technology journalists, myself included, and had us all come out to their corporate headquarters and sat us down and had a very frank discussion and said, the reason I brought you here is to tell you face-to-face that you might all want to think about finding another job, because we're moving everything to the cloud and IT is no longer going to be needed. Well, as you can imagine, that was extremely unsettling. I'd worked in IT for a long time at that point. What else was I going to do? And yet, here I had a major industry influencer saying that this was going to be the end of the IT industry. Thankfully, it wasn't. In the end, the cloud had the opposite effect. It kind of complicated things, and it changed the way that IT operated, but it wasn't the end of the IT industry. And then the last bullet point on the list is that in the end, all these technologies and trends ended up being unstoppable, and they were embraced by businesses and consumers alike. Now, I realize I've spent several minutes going through this list, but there's a method to the madness. The reason why I wanted to talk about all of these points is simply to underscore the fact that these are all the same things that are being said about AI today. And if we look at the way that all of these other transformative technologies played out over time and matured, I think that we can expect very similar things from AI. The bottom line is that technology changes over time, but human behavior doesn't. So if we look at things that were slated to have a similar impact on the IT industry and see how that came out, it can really give us kind of a clue of what we might expect from AI. But there are, of course, some differences with AI. And one of those differences is that AI has actually been around for a really, really long time in one form or another. So people have had time to get used to the idea of AI, whereas that might not necessarily have been the case with some of the other trends and technologies that I mentioned. So how long has AI been around for? Well, the first AI system was proposed way back in 1950. I mean, think about that. That's almost 70 years ago. The first AI system was created in 1965, and the first chatbot dates all the way back to 1966. Then in 1997, we had a really significant milestone, and this is something I'm going to come back to and talk about briefly later on in the presentation. But in 1997, IBM had a computer called Deep Blue, and it was an AI engine connected to a robot, and it beat the world chess champion at the time. So that was an extremely significant milestone. And then the last point on the slide is that Apple created Siri back in 2011. It doesn't really seem that long, but if you think about it, 2011, that's been, 13 years? So Siri's been around for a while. So if AI has such a long and storied history, why now? Why the sudden interest in AI? Well, I think what it really boils down to is that AI has become far more capable and more powerful in recent years than ever before. And now it's able to do some things that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Just look at ChatGPT and some of the things that it can do. And the reason why that's largely happened is due to a variety of factors. One is huge investment in the range of billions of dollars from various tech companies, but also cloud-scale computing resources, because never before has there been such a vast collection of computing power that can be concentrated on training AI. And once we start using quantum computing for AI training, all bets are off. It's really going to be able to do some phenomenal things. Also, there are massive amounts of data that are available for training AI. That's something that's never been available to us before, at least not to this scale. And then the last point on the slide is that transfer learning is being combined with training as a way of increasing AI's capabilities. Now, that one requires just a little bit of explanation for anybody who's not familiar with the inner workings of AI. Basically, what this means is that whenever you create an AI engine, that AI engine has to be trained against data before it can do anything useful. It has to be able to recognize various patterns. And so the AI engine analyzes a data set over and over and over again, typically millions of times, until it starts recognizing patterns and gets really good at what it's been trained to do. So with that in mind, let's go back to the example earlier of the IBM Deep Blue AI-enabled robot that I was talking about earlier, the one that beat the world chess champion. IBM had presumably trained this robot against millions of games of chess, and the robot ended up learning the game so well that it was able to beat the world chess champion. Now, let's say for a moment that IBM decided to create a second robot that would do the exact same thing. They didn't actually do this, but let's pretend for a moment that they did. Well, they wouldn't necessarily have to start training this robot from scratch the way that they did with their first one. Instead, they could use something called transfer learning, essentially copying the training data from the first robot that they created and putting that into the other one. So the second one wouldn't have to start from square one. It would already, on the very first day of operation, have the exact same knowledge as the original one that had been trained on raw data. So that's transfer learning, and transfer learning has played a huge role in the way that AI's capabilities have increased so rapidly in recent years. But where things get really interesting is when you start combining traditional training with transfer learning. Because, okay, this example is totally impractical, but let's suppose that having Deep Blue beat the world chess champion isn't good enough. Let's say that for some reason they want to make that robot even better at playing chess. Well, if you've got two robots that both have the same knowledge, the first one has been trained, the second one inherited that training data through transfer learning, and then you train them against themselves. You have them play chess against each other. Well, then that learning is going to be taken to a whole nother level, and that's kind of where we're at today with regard to AI training. So how will AI impact IT? Well, there are several different AI technologies that are really starting to come about. Some of these have been around for a while. Some are just now starting to be released. But there are a few things that I want to talk about throughout this presentation before I delve deeply into the question of, is your job at risk to loss by AI? The first one that I'm going to talk about is software, specifically copilots. Then I'm going to talk about how AI is likely to change user interfaces. And then from there, I'm going to go into a really short discussion on IoT and edge computing and the role that we can expect AI to play there. And I'll talk a little bit about software development. Now, the last one on the list, troubleshooting, I'm not really going to be able to get into that one simply because of time constraints. But the idea being that there are any number of tools that exist right now that are AI-enabled and are for IT pro use. I kind of think about this as being similar to when the cloud first started gaining mainstream popularity. When the cloud became popular, pretty much every software package that I can think of, even if it was something that was meant to run on the desktop or in the data center, all of a sudden the word cloud appeared in the marketing material. Every product almost overnight was suddenly branded as cloud-enabled, cloud-compatible, cloud-capable, et cetera, et cetera. And we're kind of starting to see the same thing with AI. Pretty much every software product out there is being AI-enabled to some degree, including the utilities that IT pros use. So we're starting to see utilities equipped with AI-based root cause analytics or the ability to ingest log files and look for anomalies. So we're seeing this with everything from troubleshooting software to security software and on and on. So let's talk about copilots. Copilots are a Microsoft creation. It's something that Microsoft demonstrated at the Build conference recently. And it's essentially the combining of a large language model interface with traditional software. And in my opinion, copilots have the potential to fundamentally transform the software industry like nothing else that we've ever seen. And the reason for this is that When copilots are being used, the users no longer have to the users no longer have to know how to use the software. That's a really big statement, but think about this for a moment. Let's suppose that someone who has never used Microsoft Excel in their entire life, never even seen it, is asked to create a really complicated spreadsheet, something with multiple tabs, lots of formulas, pretty much anything that you can imagine. So this user sits down at a computer, they open up Excel, they've never seen it before, and they open up Copilot, and they just use a natural language query and type a detailed description of what it is that they need, and then the software creates the spreadsheet for them. They don't need to know how to create a formula. They don't need to know how to set up ranges. They don't need to know any of that. The software does all of the work. And not only does the software keep them from having to know how to do all of that, it creates this much quicker than they could ever do it manually, even if they were an Excel expert. That's why I say that copilots have the potential to be so transformative. And it's not just that the user is able to interact with the software in such a new way. It's the fact that Microsoft is releasing an API that will allow third-party software vendors to create their own copilots. So now, once this API is out there and the software vendors have had a chance to use it, we'll see copilots potentially for just about anything that you can imagine. So if a user is asked to come in and use a really complicated piece of software, maybe a CAD program or something like that, all of a sudden the experience is going to be far easier for them because of the use of these copilots. So let's take a look at what a copilot looks like for the benefit of anybody who might not have seen the demo at Build. I've got several screenshots that I'm going to show you, and these screenshots came directly from the demo that Microsoft did. I took these off of YouTube. So the first one that we see is a message being composed in Microsoft Outlook. And you'll notice down toward the bottom of the screen capture that we have a Copilot window, and the person doing the demo typed in text that said, "Announce Tasha is graduating from high school and how proud we are, and we're throwing a celebration with friends and family. Include logistics from Glenwood Springs confirmation." So think about this one for a moment. They're not only telling Copilot what it is that they want to create, they're also telling Copilot where to get the information that it needs in order to do a good job. They're actually referencing an email that had come in previously and telling Copilot, okay, here's what I want you to create, but pull in information from this email as relevant so that the recipients of this email that you're creating will have the information that they need in order to take action. So the message gets composed, and you can see on the screen what this message looks like when it's done. And there are several buttons that appear at the bottom of the screen. There's an insert button, so in other words, if this message is absolutely perfect, you click insert and you're done. There's also an adjust button. I'll come back to this one. I'll show you an example of adjust on the next slide. Then we have regenerate. The regenerate button also exists in ChatGPT. It's essentially just a button that you can use if the resulting text is absolutely nothing like what you intended and you want to throw it away and start over and have it generate a completely new message. And then there's an edit button that you can use to make manual edits to the text. So here we see the same thing in PowerPoint. Here in the demo, the person presenting the demo asked PowerPoint to create a presentation for them. And right now the adjust button has been clicked. And what you can see from the adjust button is that you're able to adjust the style of the presentation. You can make the presentation fun, colorful, professional, minimalist, sentimental, festive. So you can tune this presentation to the mood of the occasion, whatever that happens to be. So here's the presentation that was created by a Copilot as a result of the little bit of text that was provided as shown in the previous slide. And you can see an excerpt of that text in the upper right corner of this slide. So you can see the Copilot came back and it said, here's a draft with 9 slides, including sections for memories, accomplishments, and advice for the future. And then it goes on to say, consider personalizing slides 7 and 9. So Copilot is essentially telling you, okay, I gave you what you asked for. Hopefully this is what you're looking for. But hey, here's 2 slides that you might want to take a closer look at because you might want to add some personal touches. So Copilot isn't just giving you what you ask for. It's also giving you advice on how to make it even better. One of the statements that was made by the presenter in the demo at Build that I found really impactful was the presenter said the average person uses less than 10% of what PowerPoint can do. Copilot unlocks the other 90%. And this really goes back to the example that I gave with Excel. like Excel, PowerPoint has a huge number of features that most people never ever use or probably don't even know that half of them exist. The point being that when you use Copilot, you don't have to know that those features exist. You don't have to know how to use them. Copilot does all the work for you. All you have to do is be able to accurately describe what it is that you want Copilot to create. And if you can do that, Copilot can do the rest. And Copilot is being integrated into other Microsoft applications. I've shown a few examples from Microsoft 365, but here's an example from OneNote. So there's a Copilot pop-up on the right, and the presenter typed in, help me create a plan for Tasha's high school graduation party for 30 to 50 people. And right away, Copilot came back and it started creating this notebook, and you can see pages for the various tasks that are associated with this party planning. And Copilot comes back and says, okay, I've drafted a plan for your review. Then the presenter says, make a to-do list from all of this. And Copilot took all of this information that it had created and made a simple, concise checklist based on all of that content so that the person who's planning the party just has this simple checklist that they can use to move forward. So what about business-related functionality with Copilot? Well, here's a really quick example of that. If you look at the window on the left side of the screen, the presenter was saying, draft a proposal for Van Arsdale, I think that's how that's pronounced, based on some meeting notes, and include product offers from the product roadmap. And then Copilot says, I've created a proposal with those two files, what's next? So Copilot was able to bring in two files that were mentioned within the prompt, extract information from those files, and then build a proposal. So then, if you look at the second slide, the person said, make it look like a prosaware proposal and pull images from and listed a document. So then Copilot is able to format that proposal based on a completely separate document and pull in images from yet another document. So it's intelligent in that it is able to interact with documents that already exist. Now, the thing that I found really, really interesting about this particular demo is that if you look towards the bottom of the second pane, it says done, anything else, and it provides suggestions. As you'll recall earlier, I said that Copilot has the ability to take what you've created but offer suggestions on how you can make it better. I mentioned that in the PowerPoint presentation, it said, hey, you may want to take a look at slides 7 and 9 and see if you can personalize that. Well, it's doing essentially the same thing here because it's saying done, is there anything else? But it offers some suggestions. There's a button you can click to add a summary, and if you click that button, it just generates a summary, as you can see in the third pane. There's a button for add more images, but then we have a button, get suggestions to improve the document. And when you click that, it comes back with some suggestions of things that you can do to make the presentation more compelling. In this case, we have use specific and quantifiable terms, add frequently asked questions. And the thing that you've got to remember is that, at least from the end user perspective, this isn't a chore list. This isn't, hey, you need to go back and make this document better by adding this, this, and this. We've all been in situations like that. It's no fun. Instead, Copilot actually does all of the work for you. If you want to add that frequently asked questions section, there's a button you can click to add an FAQ, and it will generate that on the fly and append it to the end of the document. So Copilot is offering suggestions on how to make the document better, but it's also giving you the tools that you can use to do that automatically. And then one last example I'll throw out there. Here we are back in PowerPoint, and the presenter typed, create a short presentation based on the proposal that was created. And then what Copilot is able to do is go in and look at that Word document that was just created and make a PowerPoint presentation to go along with it based on the information within that Word document. And it provides a really consistent look and feel and consistent information with the document. So a few key takeaways about Copilot is that Copilot is super powerful. You've seen several examples, but one of the big takeaways is that Copilot is able to work across applications. You saw in that very last slide how it was able to work across Word and PowerPoint at the same time. It's able to pull in documents from various sources. Now, Copilot does nearly all of the work for you, but you do have to review the results for accuracy. Microsoft has never made any secret of the fact that Copilot can and occasionally does make mistakes, so it's important to just review what's been generated rather than sending it out without ever looking at it. Also, as I mentioned, these aren't the only Copilots that are available. Microsoft's developing Copilots for Office, Windows, Edge, and a lot more. There's even a security copilot. And then Microsoft is making that Copilot API that's going to be available to third-party developers. So what are some potential problems with Copilot? Well, the most obvious one is job loss. You saw through the demo some of the astounding things that Copilot can do, and it can do these in a matter of seconds. So a document that would have taken me all afternoon to write, Copilot might take 15 seconds to create the same document. So there is certainly a potential for job loss, and that is something I'm going to talk a lot more about as we get towards the end of the presentation. Another potential problem is unrealistic expectations for management, because management might suddenly think, okay, Copilot works at these blinding speeds, you should be able to produce a whole lot more work in a whole lot less time. And while there is a degree of truth to that, there's also the potential for unrealistic expectations. A bigger potential problem that I see is skipping the review process, because it's way too easy to take all of this information that Copilot generates and not even read it, just assume that it's correct and send it off on its way. And who knows what mistakes might exist in that. And that leads to another potential problem, and that is using Copilot as a substitute for a qualified professional. For example, let's say that you've crafted a legal document, which there is going to be a legal plugin for Microsoft Edge that will be able to generate legal documents. If you did something like that, you probably want to have a lawyer actually review what's been created rather than just assuming that it's correctly. But because it's so quick and easy to use Copilot and you don't have to involve a lawyer, there's probably going to be some temptation to just assume it's correct and send it out as is. And then doing things too quickly. One of the demos that I saw with Copilot involved an Instacart plugin for Microsoft Edge. And the person performing the demo found a recipe online, and they told Copilot, hey, make me a list of the ingredients needed to make this recipe, and then add those ingredients to my Instacart, and then it's all on its way and being delivered. But this person who did the demo, and yes, I get it that it was just a demo done for a conference and not a real-life situation, but they went through this super quickly, and it was obvious that they didn't actually read the recipe right then and there. So I can only imagine a situation in which the ingredients show up from Instacart, and the person starts looking through the ingredients like, hey, this recipe has raspberries in it. I hate raspberries, or something like that, just from doing things a little too quickly and not taking the time to read, just because Copilot makes things so easy. So now that I've spent some time on Copilots, I want to take just a moment and talk a little bit about user interfaces and the potential impact that we might see from AI. So I think we're probably, or most of us are probably familiar with ChatGPT. It uses what's called a large language model. In other words, you can type very descriptive queries about what it is that you're wanting, and it responds in natural language responses. That's what I mean by a large language model. And the interesting thing about having a large language model is that it really lends itself to creativity. You can do some bizarre things just to amuse yourself, for no other reason than having fun. For example, when I was first experimenting with ChatGPT, I thought it would be fun to try to recreate classic literature, but in a totally different style. So I asked ChatGPT to rewrite the first few paragraphs of Moby Dick in the style of Edgar Allan Poe. And believe me, that was as amusing as it was unsettling. All of a sudden, the whale was, I believe ChatGPT called it, that cursed Leviathan from the deep. Good times. At any rate, even though large language model-based text parsers are relatively new, text parsers have been around forever. Back in the 90s, Sierra Online created a series of adventure games. You might be familiar with King's Quest, Space Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, some of those games. They all use text parsers. And you had to type in a line instructing the character in the game of what you wanted to do. But these were really simple text queries, things like open door, look window. So it was usually a verb and a noun, very similar to what PowerShell commandlets are based out of. If you've written code in PowerShell, you know that most PowerShell commandlets are constructed of verb-noun combinations, and text parsers of old were the same way. But large language models aren't limited in this way. They don't limit the number of words that you use, and they don't force you to adhere to a very specific convention when you're entering a query. You're free to type in as descriptive of a query as you like, and most of the time you'll get a very descriptive answer back. So with that in mind, Copilot is based on one of these large language models. And my guess is that eventually, and I'm not talking about tomorrow or in 6 months from now or anything like that, but eventually we might see Microsoft making some major changes to the user interface simply as a result of Copilot making the user interface elements that we're all familiar with obsolete. I mean, remember what I said earlier. With Copilot, you don't even have to know how to use the software. You just have to know how to ask for what it is that you're wanting. So technically, you don't even need a lot of those buttons that appear on the toolbar. So if Microsoft took the step of removing those elements, it would shrink the code base. It would make it a lot easier for Microsoft to maintain that code and also less expensive to maintain the code. And it would also make it a lot easier to run that application on small screen devices. So you may see some of the traditional interface elements start disappearing. Or another possibility is that Microsoft might create an expert mode for those elements. In other words, the elements are hidden by default, but by enabling expert mode, they reappear so that you can use the software manually the way that you did in the past. So just to kind of give you an idea, on the left side of the screen is Microsoft Word, the version that we're using today. On the right side is WordPad. It does very similar things, but it's not quite as capable as Word. So it doesn't have quite as many design elements. So you might see Word look more like WordPad in the future. In case you're wondering what Microsoft has to say about this, they haven't really said anything, but in the demo at the Build conference, this screen briefly appeared. So this is presumably a pre-release build of Word. And you'll notice with the big blue arrow, it's got Copilot listed on the toolbar. But if you look at the toolbar, you'll notice that it's nowhere near as, what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't have nearly as much clutter and as many elements as Word does today. If I go back to the previous slide, you can see what Word looks like today. And if you compare that to what Microsoft showed in that demo, you can see that the toolbar is a whole lot cleaner. Copilot has taken the place of a lot of those design elements. What I expect Microsoft to end up doing in the future is producing a version of Word that looks more like this. Now, this didn't come from Microsoft. This is just something that I created on my own. But what I've done is kept the most basic user interface elements and then put a large Copilot window up in the upper right corner. So that's what a future version of Word could potentially look like. So what else might we expect from AI? Well, one of the things that we can look for is AI being heavily incorporated into IoT and edge computing. And the reason for that is simple. IoT devices and edge devices generate a huge amount of data. And it's not cost effective to send all of that data up to the cloud for processing. It's a lot more cost effective and more efficient to deal with that data at the device level rather than to send it elsewhere. And besides, in some cases, the latency alone might make it impractical to send that data off. Think about a driverless car, for example. A driverless car has countless sensors that are all pulling in various types of data, and that data has to be synthesized so that the car can make decisions. And that has to be done very, very quickly in order to avoid a collision. So imagine if that driverless car had to upload the data to the cloud for processing. If it encountered latency, that could cause a huge problem because the vehicle could be in a crash before it was ever able to make a decision on how to respond to the data. Or what if a loss of signal occurred? Then the data wouldn't be processed at all. So we're going to start seeing a lot more applications where data gets processed internally by these devices using AI. What about software development? Well, I don't want to delve too heavily into software development because I'm not a developer. Yes, I write a lot of PowerShell code, but that's kind of the extent of my development. But still, this is something that's going to impact the IT industry, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about it. One of the things that we've seen for a while now with regard to software development is that you can use ChatGPT to generate code for you. I've done quite a bit of experimentation on my own with using ChatGPT to write PowerShell code. And early on, or I say early on, but even as recently as maybe a month ago, what I've very often found was that the code that ChatGPT generated didn't actually work. Typically, I would have to debug that code, and then I would tell ChatGPT what I did so it could learn from that debugging and hopefully make better code in the future. More recently, though, I've started noticing a couple of other things. One is that the code tends to run, but you might not always get exactly what you ask for. Case in point, this screen capture. I asked ChatGPT to write a PowerShell script that displays the words "Hello World" in a blue pop-up window within a GUI interface. And what I was expecting was the whole window to be blue, and you can see that instead what we got was a blue box around the text rather than the whole window being blue. So presumably being a bit more descriptive could fix a problem like that, but the point is that the code works. Another thing that I've kind of noticed about ChatGPT, and this one could be a coincidence, I'm honestly not sure, but occasionally when I'll ask it to write PowerShell code, I'll end up getting code that appears like it may have simply been downloaded from the internet. Because I'll ask it about things that I've done in the past so that I can compare the code that it writes to code that I've written manually. And sometimes it'll be identical to scripts that I've published within articles, even right down to having the same variable names. So I don't know if that's a coincidence or if ChatGPT is simply downloading code off of the internet. It could be either. I'm not sure. Now, when it comes to development, Microsoft is also using some AI-based development tools of its own. In a recent conference, Microsoft showed something called Codex, and they described Codex as making up half of a pair programming team. Now, if you're not familiar with pair programming, which I wasn't either, it's the idea that you have a single workstation with two keyboards and two developers. So the two developers work together to write code. And so what Microsoft is saying is that AI could take the place of one of those two developers. And so Microsoft did a demo in which they asked Codex to create a program that would calculate the probability that in a single elimination tournament, the second best player would end up finishing last. And the really impressive thing about this demo, which you can see some screen captures from right here, is that Codex wrote the code, and initially the code didn't work. And Codex was smart enough to realize that the code didn't work, so it did a round of debugging, it ran the code again, and it realized that the code still didn't work right, so it did another round of debugging, and it kept doing that, and eventually Codex got it right until and the code ended up working perfectly. Now, something else that I found really interesting with regard to what Microsoft is doing with AI with regard to development is that they've come up with something called Express Design. And Express Design is designed to work with Microsoft Power Apps, which Power Apps is essentially a codeless development platform. You can use drag and drop to build simple applications for those who have never used Power Apps before. But the cool thing is that this Express Design allows you to take a hand-drawn sketch and turn it into a functional application. Let me show you what this looks like. So again, this came from a Microsoft demo. I took screen captures off of YouTube. But the process starts with just creating a sketch of what you want the application to look like. So here you see somebody with a notepad, and they've created a form that asks for name, date, address, city, state, zip, and a few other things. So then they take a picture of it with their phone, and they upload it to Power Apps. So once in Power Apps, there's a few things that have to be done. There are components that have to be tagged. You have to designate the difference between fields, text labels, buttons, et cetera, et cetera. But with just a little bit of work, you end up with something like this, and you can see the finished app in the screen on the right. So that's what's coming of application development. So the big question that I want to touch on now, after everything that I've talked about, is what is all of this going to mean for IT jobs? Is AI going to make our jobs easier? Is it going to change the way that we do things? Or are we all going to be out of a job in the future as a result of AI taking over? Well, the answer to that question is that nobody knows yet. The future isn't written. We have no idea how this is going to play out. I'll be totally honest with you about that. Now, having said that, there are two main schools of thought on the subject. The first school of thought is that AI is going to put everyone out of work. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. Enough said. The second school of thought, and this tends to be the one where I lean, is that IT is going to evolve, but IT jobs will still exist. There may be some people that get displaced, but I think that the IT industry as a whole is probably still going to stick around. So let's delve into these a little bit. We'll start with the idea that AI is going to put everyone out of work. Interestingly, you can make a plausible case for either one of these schools of thought. So if we're talking about AI putting everyone out of work, well, there are a lot of different flavors of AI out there, some that I haven't even talked about in this presentation. There's one called DALL-E. For anybody who hasn't seen this, what you can do is enter a text description similar to what you've seen in some of the other elements in this presentation. And whatever you describe, DALL-E is going to draw for you. Incidentally, this is the same technology that Microsoft is incorporating into a new product called Microsoft Designer. And again, you can ask for some really bizarre things, and it will actually do it most of the time. Late last year, or it might have even been early this year, I can't remember, Microsoft gave me an early access to its Microsoft Designer program. And so I just started entering the most bizarre things I could possibly think of to see if AI would be able to generate it. And I took a break. I walked downstairs, and my wife had been downstairs watching an old Godzilla movie. And the movie cut to commercial, and it was a toothbrush commercial. So I thought, okay, I'm going to ask DALL-E to give me, ask Microsoft Designer to show me a picture of Godzilla brushing his teeth. I thought that was just way too far out in left field, but it actually did it. So DALL-E is able to come up with all kinds of crazy stuff. So the idea being DALL-E is going to replace artists, it's going to replace graphic designers. Then you've got things like ChatGPT that could potentially replace customer service workers, authors like myself, programmers, and things like that. And then you've got all of these root cause analytics programs and log file analytics programs that could potentially put other types of IT pros out of business because the IT pro becomes obsolete. And then there's the potential for Copilot to replace office workers. You've just seen how a few simple queries could produce an entire day's worth of work in a matter of a couple of minutes. So certainly there is the potential for AI to put people out of work. And there is a historical basis for this. For example, we've all seen how in retail establishments such as grocery stores and big box stores, a lot of times self-checkouts have largely replaced cashiers. We've also seen video streaming services replace video stores. A lot of factory workers and warehouse workers have been displaced by robotics. And even like where I live kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and yet there's a big box retailer that's maybe 10 miles from where I live that uses robotics to mop the floors and to stock the shelves. Bank tellers have been replaced by ATMs and online banking, and travel agents have been replaced by travel sites. And this sort of idea of technological innovation causing job loss goes way, way back when. It isn't a recent thing. I mean, you think about a long time ago, there were elevator operators, but those were replaced by automation. There was also a time when making a telephone call required the assistance of a switchboard operator, but that's no longer the case either. And even bowling alleys used to use people to set up pins between each frame. And of course, now that's done with the aid of machinery instead of human intervention. So the point being, there's a really long history of technology replacing employees as technology progresses, and certainly AI carries the same potential. Now, having said that, the other school of thought, and the one that I tend to fall more into, is that AI isn't the first threat to the IT industry, nor will it be the last. There's a long history of threats against IT jobs, and AI is just the more recent one. So my guess is that some IT jobs may go away, but the IT industry itself is probably safe. I told you the story earlier about cloud services and the tech CEO who called a bunch of tech journalists and told them they might want to think about different jobs because IT was going away. And yet that didn't happen. I think that what we're going to see with AI is going to be similar. The nature of IT jobs are going to change, but those jobs aren't necessarily going to go away. So I think of I think of AI as posing a similar threat as the consumerization of IT. Now, for those who might not be familiar with the consumerization of IT, it was a trend that it didn't really receive all that much attention, but the term was popular, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, something like that. The idea being that IT was being dumbed down to the point that consumers could do things that were traditionally the domain of IT pros. And there are a lot of examples of this. For example, the average person probably knows what an IP address is, whereas at one time that certainly wasn't the case. I can think of a time many, many years ago when my mom came over to my house and saw my network switch and asked what that box was that had all of the telephone cords going into it, assuming that those were RJ15 connectors instead of RJ45. She didn't know what a network switch was. Today, even though my mom isn't tech savvy in the least, she knows what a router is. She knows what a network cable is. And you can even go to Walmart sometimes and they'll have RJ45 cables along with the impulse items at the checkout. That's what I mean by the consumerization of IT. The idea that things that were previously the sole domain of the IT industry can now be done by consumers. And Wi-Fi routers are probably the very best example of that. I got my first Wi-Fi router back in the late 90s, and at that time most people had never even heard of Wi-Fi. And this router cost thousands of dollars, and let me tell you, setting it up was no small task. It required quite a bit of IT knowledge and several hours to set up. It was a tough process. Today, anybody can go to a store, pick up a router for, maybe $50, $75, something like that, go home, plug it in, and have it up and running in a matter of minutes. So that's the consumerization of IT. It's taking things that once only IT pros were able to do and making it so that anybody could do it. And when the consumerization of IT was really happening, there were a lot of IT pros that were afraid that it was going to lead to job loss. Because after all, if consumers know how to do all of these things that previously only IT could do, what do they need IT for? But as we saw, IT never actually went away, just the jobs evolved a little bit. So the requests that are now coming in from end users aren't quite as simplistic as what they used to be. There's more skill that's required in order to address the questions that come from the end users because the end users are more tech savvy than they were at one point. And I honestly think that's going to be the case with AI. It's just going to force IT to up its game a little bit. Another thing that I think about with regard to the future of IT as it relates to AI is that no matter what technologies are available, there are always going to be companies out there that are looking for ways to leverage the latest technologies as a way of improving their bottom line. And if you really stop and think about it, that's what IT is all about. It's all about using technology to solve business problems, period. That's it, nothing more, nothing less. So what I think is that AI is simply going to become a tool. And like many other tools, there are going to be various flavors of AI. So the IT pro's job might turn into helping organizations figure out which AI engines they should be using, which ones they shouldn't be using, and how to make it all work together to solve various business problems. So my thought is that IT is probably going to become a lot less about all of the day-to-day stuff and a lot more about helping businesses to figure out the best way to apply the available technology. So that's where I see the future of IT, at least I hope so. So with that, I know I've covered a ton of ground. I want to go ahead and hand it back to David and open it up for some questions and answers.
Okay, great job.
Thanks.
And I would like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session, so send them on in. And we have several in the Q&A console right now, so let's just dive right in. Okay, here's a question about data privacy. Well, actually, the bad guys, actors. Question from Clint Foster. Have we started seeing widespread adoption of AI among bad actors in the threat landscape?
I don't know. That's a really difficult question to answer. I've read quite a bit of material about how AI is being leveraged by the bad actors. Whether that's being done in real life or whether it's something that security pros have been coming up with and saying this is a big threat, this is something we should be paying attention to, kind of remains to be seen because, it's kind of difficult to ask an attacker if they're using this. My guess is that they probably are, and there are a couple of reasons why I say that. One, cyber criminals are nothing if not creative, and they have a long history of leveraging the latest technology for use in their attacks, so why wouldn't they use AI? Another thing that I think about is that it's pretty easy to do. I had heard at one point that OpenAI was going to engineer ChatGPT so that it wouldn't compose phishing emails, which was one of the initial attack vectors that people were so afraid of, cyber criminals making much more convincing-looking phishing emails. And I was kind of curious about that. So rather than asking it to create a phishing email, what I did was I took a message from Microsoft's I forget the name of it. They've got a phishing simulator that's built into Microsoft 365. And I took one of the bait messages from that, and it had all of the common grammatical mistakes and that sort of thing. And I asked ChatGPT to clean it up and make it sound more professional, and it actually did it. So I'm thinking that there's a very real potential for the criminals to be using tools like that to up their game.
Okay, the questions are pouring in. Let's try to get to as many as we can. There's one from Stephen. How can we best know which LLM to use for a particular task?
At this point, probably trial and error. Unless a particular large language model specifically markets itself as being designed for the task that you're trying to do, then it's probably a no-brainer to use that particular large language model. Okay.
There's a question from Thomas about accessibility. Can everybody see how Copilot is going to revolutionize accessibility for the disabled? What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, that is something that has been talked about, and it isn't just Copilot. There are several other technologies that are also being applied that way. For example, there was a project within Microsoft. I don't know if this is still going on or not, but there was a group that was looking at using HoloLens for doing computer-assisted vision for the sight impaired. For example, somebody lays down money on a counter to pay for something. The HoloLens would have been able to identify what currency was put down and verbally tell the person the amount so that they don't have to guess. So there are all kinds of different ways that Copilot and various other forms of AI are being used to help the disabled.
Okay, and here's that question about data safety from Q Thomas in the audience. Does using Copilot share data with Microsoft? How is our data safeguarded when using Copilot?
That's a really interesting question. Last week, Microsoft ended up releasing the pricing on Copilot, and for anybody who's curious, it's not just going to be available as a new feature in Microsoft 365. I had assumed it was, but it's not. The pricing that Microsoft put in released was $30 per user per month on top of your Microsoft 365 license. But the reason why I mention that is because in that same press release, Microsoft also said that one of the reasons why they encourage people to use Copilot as opposed to using some of these open source large language models is because they are concerned about data privacy and safety. They said that when you use Copilot, your data never leaves your particular Microsoft 365 tenant. All the analytics are done within that tenant, and they never leave that. So presumably that's going to lend itself to data privacy and security. How that actually plays out in the real world remains to be seen, but at least that's the message that's being put out.
Okay, let's try to squeeze in one or two more quick questions. From Cynthia in the audience. Scary to think as an IT pro, I may be out of a job in a very few short years. How do I move into the AI field?
Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that. I would say start by learning everything that you can about how AI works. There's a website you may want to check out. It's edx.com, and what it is it's an online learning platform. It's a huge collection of free courses by various universities, and there are quite a few AI ones. You can learn AI programming. You can learn the functional aspects of AI. There's some awesome material out there, and every bit of it's free, so that might be a good place to start learning about AI if you're thinking about transitioning into an AI-related career.
Okay, great. One last question. Assuming that AI can generate functional code, are there any significant risks associated with allowing AI to create scripts or applications?
I would say that the only real risk is in not reviewing that code before you use it, because if you simply ask AI to generate code for you and then you take that code and run with it, you don't know what else is in that code. You don't know, was that code written in a secure manner? Does that code contain any functions that maybe shouldn't be there, that your script doesn't actually need? So the review process is absolutely critical, but assuming that you're reviewing the code, you understand how it works, I don't think there's anything wrong with using AI to generate the code. If anything, use it as a starting point and then just work from there as you normally would.
That sounds like sound advice. Okay, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for, so thanks again, Brian, for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.
Thank you for having me.
Everyone else, stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back at the top of the hour for our second session of the day, Understanding and Using Microsoft's AI Tools for IT Pros. So take this chance to check out those resources on your console provided by CoreView, Data Robot, and Data Miner, and we'll be right back. Okay, welcome back, everyone, to our second session called Understanding and Using Microsoft's AI Tools for IT Pros. Our speaker for this session is Joey D'Antoni, Principal Consultant at Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. Joey is recognized as a VMware vExpert and a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and has over 20 years of experience working in both Fortune 500 and smaller firms. He has worked extensively on database platforms and cloud technologies and has specific expertise in performance tuning, infrastructure, and disaster recovery. Joey, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you, David, and welcome, everyone. Brian's session was excellent. I got to catch some of that, and lots of good questions. Feel free to chime in with any questions. While Brian kind of talked about the future of AI and where it's going, what I wanted to do and what I decided to do for this session was kind of dive in and kind of tell you what the state of the art is now. And this is going to be kind of strictly focused on Microsoft. We're obviously going to talk to some other tools like ChatGPT, because I think that's one of the things that came up a lot in the last session was, talking about, will ChatGPT take my job? What are the ramifications of this? And I just wanted to kind of talk about where everything is now. What I did to kind of get ready for this, and you'll see it in some of my slides, is I went through kind of all the demos Microsoft did on this stuff at Build, and I wanted to see what was available now and what's not available, and how it works, and what kind of things it can do and what the limits are. I talked to a couple of colleagues on the Windows teams about directions, but like everything I'm going to share is non-NDA, so this is kind of where everything is now, what Microsoft has publicly announced, and where I think some of these things are headed. Because I think the first thing I want to say is in my job as a consultant, I see a lot of systems, and usually when people call us, it's not because they're like, hey, we have this awesome system and we want you to validate that it's working correctly still. It's usually like, hey, we have this system and it sucks. We want you to help fix it. So that kind of leads into where I think some of this is heading. Will AI replace some low-level, some really basic programming? Yeah, I think so. I think there are some good solutions. I had a colleague who emailed me a few weeks ago and was like, hey, check this out. I got ChatGPT to generate this PowerShell script in Azure to do something in Azure. On the other hand, I tried to do something slightly more complex. It wasn't a very complex thing. I don't even remember specifically what it was, but it was deploying a set of resources in Azure. And ChatGPT gave me code that was like 5 years old and used old libraries. So like Brian mentioned, when you're using any tools like this, it's super important to review what code it puts out. And even though I think business folks may try to leverage it to try to reduce the amount of programmers you have or developers you have, it's hard to replace humans because you have that human input and you understand business requirements. And sometimes you can translate that into things that you can give code. But a lot of times it really takes the validation. So just to give you a point of reference, we were rebuilding a lot of database code for this client, and they had a lot of business logic in their code. And sure, there were things I could see that needed to be optimized and were optimized, could be optimized. But at the same time, I couldn't just rewrite the code without talking back to their business team to understand what their business requirements were around, what does this date actually mean? How do we determine these? So humans are still an important element, and it's really, really hard to define business logic. And while I think AI is going to change a lot of things and really help and make people more productive, I don't think it's going to eliminate humans, I hope. Yeah, there are some horror stories that you read out there, but a lot of things still depend on humans. So one of the things I wanted to tell you about before you get into this is what I set up for this. So I built a new Windows machine this week. It was just a virtual machine, and this is a screenshot of the desktop there. In order to take advantage of Copilot on Windows, you do have to be in the Windows preview program, and you have to be on the developer release builds. Don't make the mistake I did and try to get on the Canary builds, because the Canary builds don't get Copilot. I don't really understand their build nomenclature, but you do have to be on a specific build of Windows. And there are some kind of feature flags in Windows that you have to enable. I used a tool. If you just Google, how to enable Copilot Windows 11 preview, you'll find a bunch of blog posts that kind of tell you the same thing. There's a few feature flags you have to enable using a tool called Viva Tool in Windows. And once that's there, you do get Windows Copilot. which is still fairly limited, but still has some kind of cool functionality that we'll talk through in this. In here you can say, get answers to complex questions, help me plan for my fishing trip, adjust my settings so I can focus, which puts you into focus mode. One of the things that was in the demo at Build that I did was you can have it go to dark mode or light mode. You can paste stuff back and forth between documents. Currently, this is fairly limited. The beta here, you get like 5 queries a day. So there is some compute costs associated with this, and for the time being, it's limited. And I know just from talking to some Microsoft folks a couple weeks ago, a lot of the OpenAI stuff that's available in Azure now is also extremely limited, and all their customers are trying to get into it. So it is somewhat challenging to get those resources. The reason why I titled this slide Copilot for Everything was, as we all know, Microsoft likes to decide on a branding for a group of things and kind of stick to that branding, at least until they change it, like they did with Azure Active Directory a couple weeks ago. But Copilot seems to be the name for these collection of AI services that may or may not have stuff in common. So let's talk through some of these services that are available, because they are somewhat different in each kind of their own way. We have Microsoft 365 Copilot. So this is going to be the thing that, in all likelihood, will help your users compose emails, will help your users build documents. My suspicion, and these are kind of forward-looking statements that I have no basis on reality, this could end up being an add-on to Office 365. I know Microsoft has said maybe not, but that's my thought. So it'll be some component of the 365 stack. This is going to be something that's very user-focused. This is going to be something that is designed and ready for end-user support. GitHub Copilot is something that has existed for a while. It's been kind of around for a couple of years, and this is an AI solution that GitHub has built to kind of help you develop code faster. In a lot of ways, it's like IntelliSense, if you've used IntelliSense in Visual Studio, but just better and broader because it's more contextual. And that's one of the things I think that's really important to kind of understand around where we think this stuff is headed. So I think the big difference, and I have another slide on this that we'll talk about later, is that from assistants and tools that we've used in the past, like Bob or Clippy or Cortana, I think the key to the LLM piece here is that all of these things are a lot more contextual. So they're going to be much more in the context of the task you're doing, and they're more aware of that. And that helps them have a more limited answer set to more effectively help you. And I think that's where things can be really useful. GitHub Copilot's probably the most mature of anything here. It's been around for a while. You can still sign up for it independently. Windows Copilot, on the other hand, that's the new feature. As I mentioned, it just released like at the beginning of this month into the preview build of Windows 11. So you will need Windows 11. That is currently free. It's just built into the OS. Since it's built into the OS, we don't really know if there's going to be a differentiated pricing model for that, or it's just going to be something that's built into the operating system. A couple of slides. I have a demo, not live, but I'll show you what it did, and it's pretty slick. It can do some pretty intelligent things around data tools, or tools and technology tools in general. Microsoft Sales Copilot is what this is called. I'm surprised they didn't just call it Dynamics Copilot. This is the hook into CRM and those sorts of things that will theoretically do artificial intelligence for our sales folks. The AI Copilot, this is the thing that's going to help you build your own AI tools. And that's a big point of emphasis, and it's a little bit like out of the scope because this session was really talking about IT pros, but a lot of the things the moves Microsoft are making in the space, and even some of the announcements at Build, are around being able to develop your own AI and being able to develop smarter tools. And I know there was a question towards the end of Brian's session about, how do you move into those AI careers? This is getting started with coding against some of these models is something you can learn about, and definitely something I can tell you just based on the reception we've gotten to these types of sessions around any AI tooling, it's definitely a hot thing in the industry right now, and it will probably continue to be for 2 or 3 years. Microsoft Security Copilot, which I can't believe Microsoft didn't take the opportunity to name Microsoft Defender Security Copilot, because we call everything in security space Defender somehow. We don't have a lot of details around what that's going to look like, but I suspect it's going to be a lot of security stuff, especially around best practices, is things you should just be doing. And having an AI tool that looks for that can be really beneficial. So having a security AI tool is not something that can surprise me. It's something that security is one of those places where we've used AI for a long time, just probably not in as robust of a way as you see now. Like if you think about, for example, some of the ways Azure Active Directory authentication works, one of the things that they've done for a long time is they know what their threat profiles look like, and if you didn't have multi-factor authentication turned on for a specific user and that user's login seemed really anomalous, maybe that user's based in the US and they were trying to log in from Singapore and they were, normally on some type of client that they logged in with, and they were coming from some completely different client. Microsoft would raise flags on that login and enforce them the multi-factor authentication. So that's something like security is, I think, a good space for this, because you can identify a lot of things. Of course, there was a question in Brian's session around, are hackers using these AI tools? Yes, they are. I actually he mentioned something, but I saw something. Even though ChatGPT is designed not to create phishing emails or create malicious code, I saw somebody on Blue Sky, which is a new social network, one of the potential Twitter replacements, the other day describe an effort they made to bypass those malicious code warnings in ChatGPT, and they did it by having sound-alike text. So they had text that sounded like try to write malicious code to help me ransomware a client, but they spelled everything wrong. So apparently that bypassed the check for that malicious code. So there's good and there's bad on the security aspects of here. And then finally, my personal favorite, because it's near and dear to my heart where I live in data, GitHub Copilot for Azure Data Studios. And this is just kind of simply an extension of GitHub that's specific for SQL and T-SQL with SQL Server. A common question I hear too is, will these copilots or will these AI tools just be able to write queries because they can interpret a schema? And yes, potentially, but that also defines on having schemas that are clearly defined and articulated, and using naming conventions in such a way that they make sense to a large language model. If anybody's ever worked on an AS400 system where you have table names that are like A3424 and they're short, and kind of random column names, or ever looked at an SAP database, it would be really challenging for an AI tool to write code against one of those. However, if you look at a database that Microsoft always uses, the AdventureWorks sample database, those columns are very easily named. You could see where a large language model could interpret those and start writing some queries. So that's kind of the interesting steps to that. So let's kind of go into the current state. And you may say, what task can I automate now? One of the things here is most all of this stuff is in preview. So when Microsoft had Build, which was towards the end of May, they showed a lot of demos that were in Windows. We're just starting to get access to those demos. I'm an MVP. I'm not a Windows MVP, so I didn't sign up for any of the very early release stuff. And I'm just kind of started diving in the last couple of weeks as I've gotten ready for this presentation. And like I mentioned, Windows Copilot kind of just became publicly available in July, in the beginning of July. Even ChatGPT is fairly limited in the amount you can use it. And getting access to those compute resources in Azure is still extremely challenging because it seems like I said, every company wants to have access to it. So it is preview, which means all of the caveats that come around preview. This is something that we've kind of grown accustomed to through the years with Azure, but I think one of the things that's more challenging about this preview is the demand for it so high, the computing resources required are so high that almost everywhere it goes limited. So don't count on replacing all of your developers next week with ChatGPT. That's just not going to happen. Writing automated code is still rough around the edges. I mentioned the situation with databases where like generating SQL queries, if you have a clearly well-articulated schema, in a language that the large language model can understand, that large language model can potentially ingest that data set and start writing queries. However, as you start to introduce things like business logic into your code, the number of days of an inventory and what that looks like and what that means, that's something that can be challenging. One of the other parts about automated code that scares me a little bit, and we talked about security, and Brian kind of mentioned this in his talk, is making sure the software supply chain, like if you have a large language model spit out, for example, a C# app for you, and that app starts using libraries that you're not really aware of, are you going to investigate all of those libraries to make sure that they're secure and they're up to date and you're using the right version? That's where like this stuff gets hard because being a developer is more than just writing code, but it can definitely help you, and I see that with GitHub Copilot. I think just the nature of GitHub and that they can analyze all the code that's stored there, they can help you build better solutions. Those are definitely the most mature of any of these solutions we're working on. So if you're using GitHub Copilot, that's probably the most robust of these solutions that we see. And so one of the things I wanted to do was, it's always funny if you've ever spoken at a big conference or ever worked with a team at a big conference, to know how much production and Hollywood kind of stuff can go into demos especially at large conferences to the state of build. I know I've presented at Microsoft Ignite a bunch, but I presented one year and I was presenting with a colleague from Microsoft, and I swear we had to go over the demo 8,000 times and test it and record it just in case. So you always like to try to demo and see what it did. So I kind of screenshotted that here, and I'll walk you through what I did. On the first panel here, you can see part of a Kubernetes manifest. If you're not familiar with Kubernetes, it's a container management system. And this is just in Windows Copilot. So this isn't using GitHub or anything. This is the new Windows Copilot feature. So I copied this entire Kubernetes manifest. In particular, what this is doing is deploying a SQL Server pod. And I just pasted it into Windows Copilot. In here, in the second panel, you can see I get, hello, this is Bing. I see you've posted some YAML code. So the first thing, it identified a YAML, which kind of makes sense. YAML's a specific code structure. So that makes sense. But it also said, figured out that I'm deploying Microsoft SQL Server. I'm guessing it made that connection by the fact that it's YAML and you're defining the image, so it's going to be able to determine that it's Microsoft SQL Server. And of course, that it's NFS volumes, because that's what you're going to use for storage for SQL Server and Kubernetes. And it gives me a few options. I can get more relevant responses. I can have it explain the code. It can tell me what Kubernetes is. It can tell me how NFS works with Kubernetes. So I asked it to explain the code because that seemed the most compelling. What this did is it walked through each section of my YAML manifest and explained it to me. So here, the relevant text that you can see in this screenshot, it determined what the image was. I was using SQL Server 2019 CU15 on Ubuntu. The deployment also set some labels, environment variables, pods, and resources and volume mounts for the pod. But what Windows Copilot did was it determined the important ones. And I think there's a bit of irony in that Windows Copilot decided that the most important parameter that I put into this manifest was that I accepted the end user licensing agreement with Microsoft. That's clearly the most important thing, because we're not just gonna push SQL Server out without accepting the license agreement. It then says the SA password variable that sets the password. It gave me a full detailed listing that I just wanted to get enough relevant text for you to get some understanding of how this works. But it gave me a full explanation of what I was doing with the container. It made some suggestions on how I could configure the container for optimal performance. And I will say I ran this demo 3 or 4 times. And one of the kind of interesting things was in the second part of this, where the get relevant responses section is in that screenshot, I did get different prompts the couple of times I ran it. I always used the same manifest, so like that never changed. But there was some variability in what came back. So I found that kind of interesting. But if I explain the code, it worked the same every time. You'll notice in that second image, there's a 2 of 5. In my experience using this, you're limited to 5 queries a day, which shows you kind of the limits of the tool right now. This is something I think is just kind of interesting. It just shows you where the limits are right now. But this works. This is what they demoed at Build. I was able to reproduce it. I think it's pretty cool. I didn't screenshot this, but I also tested just kind of a random PowerShell code. And I wanted to do something that wasn't like native to Microsoft. So there's a PowerShell module called DBA Tools that we use a lot. It's a community supported project. It helps DBAs who use SQL Server do their job more efficiently. So I kind of just posted in a random bit of PowerShell from a DBA Tools commandlet. Copilot was able to analyze that code. It told me where it was from. It pointed back to what it was doing. So I was pretty impressed. I think static code analysis is something that's very good and can be very helpful, especially to newer users or newer developers. So one of the more common questions we get around these feature sets is this just Bob, Cortana, or Clippy? Because we've had these tools before and they've worked okay. I think Clippy was kind of awful, but Clippy was kind of early days. Cortana was a little bit better, but I think one of the things about Cortana is it was too Microsoft centric, right? It was not a broader solution that we saw. I think conceptually these Copilot tools are very similar. Having a smart assistant, you see it. I use an iPhone, and I know Android has similar features. You see it where your phone tries to do smart things for you, and that's kind of nifty. The big difference here, I think the technology behind these solutions are much more robust. We have larger models. We have higher levels of compute. We're going to talk a little bit more about compute later. But machine learning technology and data science have allowed these large language models to make more contextual decisions around analysis. And I think I mentioned that context a little bit earlier. I think that's something that is really important because it narrows the result sets. If you think about it from a computer science perspective, or even from a SQL query perspective, it's almost like using more specific where clauses, right? So if your predicate in your query narrows down, you're not going to have to look for as many rows as your answer. And if you can narrow down the context of a question you're asking, this is something that can be really, really helpful. And one of the places, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this on the next slide, where I think this can really really help, is with support. I don't know if anybody's worked with Microsoft support lately. Like in the last 5 years, it seems to have gotten progressively worse. Like a chatbot can't be any worse, because maybe at least they'd read the text I entered into the support ticket. That's something where I see a big use case, because especially with the cloud providers, support just doesn't scale. I can see those sorts of things working pretty well, especially for first and even second level support. A lot of the problems we have where we have to go to support for Azure, it's really just a matter of getting somebody to look at the logs. So that's something that can be easily automated. One of the other things is Windows 11 is better optimized for hooking into these AI solutions. Copilot kind of gives it a robust framework to do that. And those hooks are just going to continue to grow over time. Microsoft is developing for these solutions, so you're going to see more and more of that. So where are these features headed? And we see Windows Terminal is getting smarter due to Copilot. This was from an article in The Verge during Build Week. And one of the things I found really interesting here, I don't know if any of you are software developers and have debugged code. Debugging code is like this art and science. And one of the things you do when you debug program code is you load up symbols. And if you're debugging Microsoft programs that aren't necessarily open source, you're gonna use what's known as public symbols. So, for example, you can get the public symbols for SQL Server, and they don't really tell you anything. And they tell you a little bit that you can maybe, if somebody on the product team is over your shoulder, they can tell you what it is. I didn't learn until I was on a project at Microsoft what happened when you get to the private symbols, where it actually points you to the line of code. And then I was like, wow, WinDebug is suddenly useful. But one of the things that Microsoft is working on and playing with, and I think this stuff probably exists if they're publicly talking about it anyway, or alluding to it, is that they're working on Copilot API for developer tools like WinDebug. WinDebug is one of those things that is really, really complex. Like if I was doing a session at a conference on WinDebug, I would probably make it. I would probably call it, a 500 level session, because it is a super advanced thing and it's really hard to use. And there's a very small subset of IT professionals who can understand what it's outputting, even though understanding that output can be beneficial to a broader set of those same professionals, right? I think from an IT perspective, where Microsoft's going to go with these solutions, is working on these higher level tasks that are really hard for people to do, and make them easier. Of course, you're going to have like some of your office features and those security things, but I think automating and making easier some of these really things that are hard and can help people and probably help reduce support tickets are something that are definitely going to be beneficial to a broader array of, especially IT professionals, because this is something that's pretty hard. So for many years, learn to code has always been this ongoing joke for people who have lost their job. And I changed this around to reference, should we learn to be plumbers as IT professionals? Because plumbing is not going away, because the stuff that plumbing takes care of will never go away as long as there are humans. I don't foresee, I think we kind of had, in some ways, an overreaction this year because of certain individuals buying technology companies and doing dumb things, and marketplaces reacting. I think we had like a little bit of an overcompensation with IT layoffs this year. But AI isn't ready to replace your job right away. That doesn't mean there's not some MBA in your company, I say that as an MBA myself, who thinks they can replace a bunch of expensive developers with AI. It's just not at that level yet. It's not. There's There's tons of code in the world that's still running systems. And one of the hardest things you could do would be to tell an AI system to rewrite and optimize the code that runs our business, that runs our ERP system, right? Like, I wish you could do that. The client I was working with recently, I would have happily done that for. I would have had ChatGPT rewrite their entire database and things would have been good. That kind of thing doesn't exist yet. And a lot of the organizations, especially the ones that are not technology organizations that are doing cutting edge research, are still running their businesses on 30-year-old mainframe software. Like, for example, I read that American Airlines the other day is trying to automate their first and second level customer service using, I don't know if they're using a large language model or not. The article didn't specify. But the same company runs their business on a 30-year-old mainframe program called Sabre. One of the challenges around that is the companies that are best suited to deal with this automation have newer systems that are more flexible and play better with these newer tools. However, I think in the short term, you're going to see learning to work with these tools is something that can help you be more productive in your job. And the important thing is to think of them as tools and not think of them as just a replacement for you. You don't necessarily want to go. You don't necessarily want to go to generate a program that does this for me, right? But like, generate some of the PowerShell things I've played with have been pretty handy. Write a PowerShell script that if you give it the right prompt, and the new job that we hear about now is prompt engineer, right? Somebody who understands what ChatGPT can do and how to prompt it. If you write it the right way, yeah, you can help accelerate your development process. It's just like IntelliSense. It's just like other tools. It's really helpful to have a broader understanding of what you're trying to build. And the people that this is going to help the most are the people who really understand, software architecture and design. Because if you can describe the problem you're trying to solve the most clearly, the tool will help you build it the best, in my opinion. So what are some other tasks? And yeah, this screenshot's a little faded, and that was kind of by design. That AI can do. So I mentioned the above static code analysis examples are a good example of what AI does well. If somebody gives you a complex Kubernetes manifest and you want to understand what it's trying to do, I saw a question around evaluating security. I think that's something else that can be good. I don't know that any of the tools do that now, but that's definitely something I could see getting implemented. I know in some of the latest GitHub, one of the announcements, because I wrote about it, at GitHub in Ignite, I believe, last year, was around how GitHub can do analysis of security in your code as part of your build process. And I think that's something that it's definitely kind of an AI tool because it's going to be pattern matching and based on things that are largely known and important. And that's something that can be beneficial. Where I feel like that one of the better things that these solutions can do is where there are complex problems that have a fixed problem set. So this is a SQL Server execution plan. I faded that so you didn't see the table names. But these things are really important to database performance. If you're not a DBA, you probably don't know what the heck this is. But when you run a query, the query optimizer generates this thing as a way to go out and get your data. It's not necessarily the most efficient way to do it. It's just what the query optimizer thinks is best. And really, if you think about it, the query optimizer is kind of its own AI solution. But there are patterns here that an AI solution could pick up. There are suboptimal query patterns. There are columns that are missing from indexes that can be high impact. Those kinds of things, and these are really hard. Once again, we're talking about levels. This is like probably 30 or 40% of DBAs can read and understand an execution plan and know how to act on them. So if you can make that solution, if Microsoft can build that into, say, SQL Server using some AI tools, they can make SQL Server more attractive, more performant, help DBAs be more productive, and help companies build better solutions. And that's something I think to keep in mind, because I think these sorts of tasks, where you have a complex solution that has a lot of, a pretty well-known set of solutions that can be fairly well defined in a large language model. Defining things that are super open-ended, it's going to be much harder to get quality into those solutions. So what else is coming? One of the things I want to mention here is one of the things that has really we've seen change over time as these AI models have become more prominent is chips and the nature of chips have changed. If anybody's been paying attention to NVIDIA's stock price, NVIDIA is now $1 trillion company. If you don't know NVIDIA, they make GPUs. One of the reasons why GPUs are so popular for these large language models is they have really high clock speed, so they can ask a lot of questions, and they do it in a massively parallel manner. So they can do things really fast and really parallel. Intel has kind of trailed behind on this, and not just that, for a number of reasons. I think you can expect more Windows on ARM, or maybe even other chips. I think one of the reasons why you could expect Windows on ARM is there's still a pretty high price premium for Intel chips, and Microsoft, being one of the largest providers of compute in the world now that they host Azure, would like to reduce that cost to improve their margins. So I highly suspect you will see more Windows on ARM. One of the benefits of some of these modern chips, and I don't want to slag on Intel because they're operating things in this space, is there's a new concept of like chiplets, where additional chips can be added to the sub-chips can be added to that physical die. So you could have, machine learning chips or even maybe GPU chips on the main processor core. So I think there's going to be a lot of hardware innovation that's going to be kind of driven by this nature of GPU-based computing. And GPUs don't work well for everything, right? So they, talking about databases specifically, they're good for, the only thing they're really good for in a database engine is generating execution plans. So anything where you have to run a bunch of different scenarios really fast, they're good at that. But CPUs are still good at the things they're good at. But ARM will give Microsoft more flexibility and, more importantly, more profit in Azure. One of the areas I see the biggest push, and you can really see this by the announcements that Microsoft made at Build, is continuing to support AI development in Windows. A lot of these features, and this kind of all hooks in, not just Windows Copilot, but there's a feature called Dev Drive in Windows and Dev Home. And these are kind of preview things that have been recently released that enable, that their aim is to help developers do their job more effectively and get those developers, built into Windows. And some of this ties into GitHub Copilot. We talked about GitHub Copilot and Terminal earlier. One of the things I saw that GitHub Copilot can do, and I think is really nifty, is automatically develop unit tests within your code. I think that's something that it's always challenging, but I think that's something too where like a model can kind of narrow down what that specific code is doing and isolate how to do a unit test. And finally, this technology is still really young. I think we're in the very, very early days of what we're going to anticipate coming. But we'll see it continue to mature over time, just like anything else. Microsoft is fully committed to this. They anticipate it being a $10 to $15 billion a year product for them in whole. And I also think there's a lot of places within Microsoft where they can foresee AI helping the company be more productive. I mentioned support earlier, and that's something that I know they've been working on, trying to automate more and more support. And not all of that's just like large language model-based AI, but it is something where like Azure is so big that it's impossible to scale the support organization to fully support all the customers that are on Azure, in my opinion anyway. So I think if you can build automation into that, you can leave with happier customers and give them better outcomes overall, while keeping your own employees a little bit happier, that they're not having to deal with the minutia of some of the things that support tickets entail. So one of the things to understand is that, to close out before we have some great questions, and if you have any questions, just put them in. We have a bunch in, so I'm happy to answer them. Large language model-based AI is here. It is part of our tool sets now. That doesn't mean you need to necessarily have ChatGPT open all the time, but it is something where ChatGPT can be kind of handy to help you get started with things, get past some hurdles. But it's not the end all be all. And I say trust, but then actually don't trust, but verify and then verify again. One of the things I've heard about, and as a writer for Redmond Mag, I have not done this. I just want to state is folks writing having ChatGPT write blog posts for them. As a writer, I don't feel like that's a cool thing to do, but if you do that, if you have ChatGPT write you a blog post, then you have to validate everything it wrote and edit it. So it really just gets you started. Or you can just put out, crap, which is something that is a little bit of a concern of mine, kind of socially and just in general about the quality of writing we see. Copilot pricing and where the compute is going to live and who's going to own that compute is something that's still a work in progress. Conceivably, it's all going to live in the Azure/O365 ecosystem. I don't know how much of that compute is going to live on the desktop itself, but it is something that is a work in progress. We don't have firm pricing other than Microsoft thinks it's going to be a big business. I think it's something you'll see change over time and evolve depending on the nature of the features. And Microsoft's demand is so high right now. I think they probably have a feeling that they can kind of price it at whatever level they would like within reason. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a new Microsoft 365 SKU that includes the AI pieces. So just something to keep in mind. And then finally, this is not a technology change you should ignore. Like, as an IT professional, you could get away with ignoring Web3 and Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. That was not something that changed the way we did IT. I think AI is something that is over time. It's gonna start small. You're gonna start seeing some small eke-ins where you see some processes, and over time you'll start to see these features, especially as they become more available in programming libraries and more tightly integrated for developers to take advantage of. You'll see them be more tightly integrated and become part of our lives a little bit more. And with that, David, do we have any questions?
We certainly do. First of all, great stuff, Joey. That was excellent information. And we have some questions in the Q&A console. And I'd like to remind the audience that we can take questions up until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next session. So please send them on in now. And let's move right to the Q&A. Here's a question from Clint in the audience. It doesn't really pertain to Microsoft specifically, but I'm sure it's on the minds of a lot of people out there. Can using AI for low-level support functions help to alleviate the workforce shortages in the IT industry?
Yeah, for sure. And that's kind of what I was talking about with Microsoft support. And you even see it just as simple as using chatbots and which, are a small AI solution. They're not robust, large language model-based AI, but using chatbots in support is definitely something that's a feature. And a lot of this Windows Copilot stuff is kind of like if you look at the demos from Build and some of the things Panos on the Windows team said in his keynote, they're aiming to kind of give regular business users of Windows some of the same power that power users like developers and IT pros who really know how things work in Windows have had for years, where you can easily do things. And, maybe we wrote PowerShell to do that or did some magic thing. But by integrating that into the OS and integrating that in the Copilot, that can eliminate some support desk things. And then I think, of course, on the big vendor side, I think if you can build out a good knowledge base and it's accessible, I think you can potentially help your customers and give them better service. And like I mentioned, the support experience with Microsoft right now is just bad. I'm not going to mince words. I haven't had a good one. So yeah, I think that's something that can definitely help.
Okay. And the questions have popped in about the time you were talking about coding and working with code. Sharon from the audience is asking for clarification. Are you saying AI is incapable of converting legacy code into another language?
That's a really good question, Sharon. No, that's kind of a solution it can do, I think, within reason. What I really meant by those comments were you can't give AI a bunch of bad code that's currently running a system that's far less than optimal and expect it to write a new system that meets the same business requirements in an optimal fashion. Like garbage in, garbage out. So if you give it garbage code and tell it to convert it from C++ to C#, you're going to have garbage C# code now. I think that's like kind of one of those static tasks that it would be good at, but it is not necessary. It can't think for you. That's kind of where I was going with that.
Okay. Another question comes from Stephen in the audience. He says, wouldn't AI be better to evaluate the security of code as opposed to creating it? If so, what is the best way to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both here. I wouldn't necessarily say it would be better at doing one of those tasks than the other, but I definitely think evaluating the security of code is something that can be useful. I don't know that anybody's developed anything specifically for that, other than I know GitHub has some static evaluations that they do. That stuff got introduced at Ignite last year. I know it's in my Redmond column. I can't remember exactly their processes for that, but they do go through and look for some malicious patterns in code. Microsoft has some stuff that they've had running as part of Defender for a while that will do that. For example, I got a warning on a customer database a couple weeks ago that's running in Azure of a risk of a possible SQL injection attack. It was not a SQL injection attack, but they did identify it as such, so I could log in and see that it wasn't. But those kind of static code analysis is something that's really good. Where it gets a little trickier is, looking for some of the common areas of security risk, like SQL injection, which I mentioned Microsoft has something for, and a lot of web application firewalls do that, but also looking for more complex things like buffer overflows that are harder to observe from static analysis, and you actually have to run the code to kind of understand if that's going to be a problem.
Okay, let's keep that thread going with a question from Demetria in the audience. Is there a fear that when checking the code from AI, there are inexperienced programmers who do not realize the inaccuracy of the solution? In your opinion, how will companies handle this concern?
As a consultant, I think generating your code from AI solutions with inexperienced programmers is the best thing your company can do. No, yeah, that's honestly one of my biggest concerns, right? You have inexperienced developers who probably, even if the code generated was good, they're not necessarily going to be asking the prompt enough questions so that the AI solution can know what they really need their code to do. And there's no easy solution to this because it's a human problem, right? You're trying to describe a set of business things that you need this code to do. and it's not just technical. And I think that's something that's going to be somewhat challenging. I don't really have a great answer on that, because if you it kind of goes back into the garbage in, garbage out thing. If you give it good examples and good requirements, it can probably develop reasonable code. But if you don't, and the people who are reviewing that don't have the experience to know what good code looks like, I think that's something that's problematic.
Okay. Let's try to squeeze in 2 more questions. Here's one from John. What are your thoughts on how copilots should be delivered to the business, i.e., owned and supported by IT, or let the business run and gun? In the past, IT has largely understood how the tech they release works, but this feels fundamentally different.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so challenging about this, and the like kind of sudden introduction of AI, is it all happened really quick. Like it kind of all of a sudden we had the GPT-4 model, and then this was a real thing. I think it's going to depend, because I think there is stuff that's definitely going to be more end user facing. Like as Microsoft introduces this into Office, that's something that's going to be 100 or 90% end user. Sure, IT folks will use Office and they'll take advantage of some of those features, but like it's just Office. That's end user stuff. Where that gets interesting is like when you start talking about the legal aspects of that. But since we're talking to technologists, I'm not going to talk about how legal probably needs to be involved before you start using AI for Office. I think some of the other solutions, though, will be more IT involved, because I think when you start building solutions on top that are custom to your company, those are things that are going to be developed in-house, right? So IT is going to have some ownership. And I think largely right now, and for the near future, this is going to be cloud-driven. So there's definitely a lot of roles for technologists involved. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Sorry, I don't have a clear answer, but I think it's complicated, and it's so complicated because it's such a broad-facing service. So like when I talked about all the various defenders, like 3 of those are just super customer-facing. Like IT is not going to be involved with Dynamics Copilot, for example.
Okay, one last question from Rodney in the audience. What are some recommended sources for technology leaders, product development leaders, and or engineers to get and stay up on AI use cases, currently best practices, etc.? Do you know any resources like that?
Of course, redmondmag.com.
There you go.
Beyond Redmond, I think just in general, the technology press. And I think one of the things that is always important to pay attention to and is the big technology conferences, right? And the cool thing is now, like, the keynotes are almost all free or online, so you don't have to be in attendance. Just kind of understanding the direction of where things are heading. I think Microsoft's been pretty clear in their forward statements. But even then, they sometimes lack in a lot of detail. But taking advantage of those things, playing with the toys that you can play with, gaining understanding of what the solutions can do, I think those are the really important things. So I think it's a mix of staying on top of the news and getting hands-on. It's not super hard to get hands-on. One thing, just from a security perspective, I will warn you about, just because I actually saw it in communication from Microsoft to me today about the MVP program. Be really careful about where you're pasting company code. Like ChatGPT is probably secure because OpenAI and Microsoft have it, but like you don't want to just like paste your organization's code into like AI solutions that you don't necessarily know the provenance of. As a security professional, don't do that.
Okay. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. So thanks again, Joey, for a great presentation and answering all those questions.